today is a firm believer in the possibility and probability of other life in space. Lights up, please. She joined the Victorian UFO Research Society in 1958. She was invited to become president of this same research society in 1978. We are glad she could come here today to tell us more about a very unique and eye-opening close encounter experience, a classic case that is known throughout the worldwide UFO community. Please welcome now Judy Magee.
Thank you, Michael, for the introduction. I didn't expect to see the Knowles case on there this morning. We investigated that one, and it was a very interesting and fascinating case. I said in this introduction that I was a firm believer in the probability of life in outer space. My belief in this came when I first joined the organization in 1958, and I met the Reverend Gill and his friend Reverend Crutwell in 1959. They were in Melbourne at the time, and they'd just come down after this experience. And as you can see there, in the lower part of the picture is Boyani. That's where the mission station was. There was a loud explosion one day, and they came out to see what had caused the explosion. There were 38 witnesses to an object which was only about 400 feet away from them, and it had 4 entities on it. 2 entities seemed to be working on the object, and then 2 would disappear, and then 2 more would come out, and on the total there were 4 entities on the shelf all at one time. And this, of course, made me believe that this object certainly was not from this planet. It remained there from about 6:45 until 10:30 one evening, and during that period of time there were about 5 or 6 smaller circular objects which came from the clouds and seemed to take up position around the top of the object. And some of these smaller ones would float away and come back again over that period of time. At 10:30 they had all left. Next, please, Andrew. That's his sketch, or an artist's sketch, of what Reverend Gill saw. So you can see the 2 entities there. He was very meticulous too about his documenting of the times, the object's appearance and the entity's appearance and disappearance. But thank you very much, Andrew, sorry. That is the Reverend Gill, and he's pointing to where the mission station was. We'll have the next one too, please. People usually describe objects as from the things that they can recognize, like the natives in New Guinea saying that these looked like tilly lights to them because they were up in the mountains where they never went to, let alone any white man. And Alexander's armies were dispersed apparently on at least 3 occasions by what they termed flying shields. And a shield, if you recall, has a dome in the middle of it where they hold it with their hands. Thank you, Andrew. I keep calling you Mike for some reason. That's the last one, thank you. My discussion today is a close encounter of Maureen Puddy. Now, Maureen Puddy's case came to my notice through radio, 3AW in Melbourne. I don't listen to radio very often, if I can help it. But on this occasion, some member rang me and said that there had been a lady speaking on the radio for about 3/4 of an hour at that stage, who'd had a close encounter with a UFO. And I spoke to Maureen, and I actually spoke to her for about an hour on the telephone, and I was intrigued by her report. And she promised to come and tell us about it at our general meeting, which she did. We had a full house there, which really surprised her, and the people overflowed out into the foyer. And she started out by saying that, although I say at the moment here, these encounters occurred in 1972, but were never written up in our publication until 1983, Review. And Maureen addressed one of our quarterly meetings in 1995 and was attentively accepted, to say the least. It has been said by some researchers who've never even met her that her case was an abduction. But to Paul Norman and myself, who investigated this one rather thoroughly, it was certainly not an abduction because we were there on the whole of the occasions, especially the third one. Her story began when her son was injured at school when a chest of drawers in the library fell on him and broke his hip. And he'd been taken to the hospital by the Royal Helicopter Angel of Mercy ambulance. And Maureen had just become the president of this service. And while driving home after visiting her son in the hospital, on the 5th of July 1972, she called at her mother's home for a cup of tea and a bit of a chat. And she left there about 9:15 p.m, taking the shortcut along the Murdoch home from Frankston. And that's the south side of Melbourne. I don't know how many of you know that area. It's quite an open area. It's sort of semi-country. And while driving home, on this occasion, she saw a blue light which came down over the car. And she thought it was the helicopter because they have a blue light that blinks on the underside of it. And thinking that the helicopter might have a message for her, she got out of the car and had a look at it. And she was really quite staggered because it was a huge object. It would have spanned the road, that's the macadam strip, plus the two side pieces on the road, which would have made it an extremely large saucer, which would be in about, the object was possibly, in her estimation, but 2 telephone poles high, and would have spanned the strip of road, which was 24 feet wide, also taking in the nature strips on the either side of the road, and making the saucer approximately 100 feet in diameter. Now, having already alighted from the car, she leaned back and took a long look at the object and wondered what it was that she was seeing. The object's surface was smooth. It had no joins or welds, seams or rivets, no windows or portholes, and no wheels. The huge object was radiating a brilliant light or blue light and an intense glow, and there was no movement, no wobbling, no rotating, but a faint humming could be heard. And she noted all these things while wondering what sort of aircraft it was before fear took over, at which time she quickly got back into the car and drove off as fast as she could, only to find the object was maintaining its speed just above and behind the car. No matter how fast she travelled, the object seemed to remain at the same distance. Aware that the blue light was no longer with her, and seeing a very bright light streak off in the opposite direction, Mrs. Puddy realised that the chase must have been over. And it followed her for about 8 minutes, or 8 miles rather. She didn't go a mile a minute, but 8 miles. The witness reported her sighting to the police at Dramana, and some family members, and also some friends who considered it all a bit of a joke. So she decided to do a little bit more about it, but not until about 3 weeks later. Then on the 25th of July, and that same year, after having visited her son again, he was there in the hospital for some time, she followed a similar route home, had a cup of tea with her mother, and left again about the same time, 9:15. She arrived at the Murdoch Road, travelled a short distance of about 1 mile when the blue light once again appeared before her. And she thought, oh no, not again. And this time I'm not going to stop. And she was hanging onto the steering wheel and nothing was going to move her from that car. And the car drifted to a stop on the side of the road. No matter what she did to the Holden car, it wouldn't reply to her demands. And she was wondering, where do I go from here? She was rather terrified and gripped the wheel and looked out the windscreen and saw the object hanging silently above the car, just in front of it and above the car. And the countryside was bathed in a blue light. Then a voice spoke to her. Not audibly, she said, but in her head, as if it was a thought put into the head. And as if words had been put into a computer and came out the other end in the most beautifully modulated and very well-spoken English. During this time, she experienced a most unusual sensation. She said if you could feel that you'd been in a vacuum, well, that was the impression that she got. It was perfectly still and perfectly quiet. And the message read, "Don't be afraid," as a pause. "We mean you no harm," another pause. "Your tests will be negative," and she'd already had some done and they were negative, but she thought they couldn't have been the ones. Tell the media, and a longer pause, and you are now in control. And at that moment the car started up again as if she had turned the key. Now she didn't touch the key at all, she just sat there, she was stunned. So the car started up because she hadn't turned it off, they had apparently. And she stopped at the same police station to find it closed. Then she went on to the next one, and still on her way home. And she told the police officer that, "I want to report a sighting of a flying saucer." "Oh, yes, madam, yes," came the reply. And she insisted in fear and frustration, so the policeman humoured her and had it recorded. The next morning she phoned Laverton RAAF station and asked if they could offer any explanation of what she'd seen, to which they replied that it couldn't have been an aircraft or a balloon, as neither would have been in the area at the time, but didn't say as it could cause panic, anything that could cause panic. They would send her a questionnaire to complete, but when asked about this later, she said you'd have to have been an astronaut to have understood it, and I believe she didn't bother to return it. But Paul and I were invited to go through the Air Force files, and we discovered that she obviously had returned it at a later date. Must have thought much better of it. Naturally, we questioned Maureen regarding her experience in the car, and what did the messages mean? She said she'd not had any recent tests, but she'd had some about 6 months before, and they had proved negative. There was no use telling her not to be afraid because she was terrified. As for telling the media, she'd phoned 3 or 4 TV stations, and one was mildly interested, and they were showing Chariots of the Gods at the time, and 2 made light of the news, and she didn't bother to contact the 3rd one or the 4th one. And I heard through a radio talkback program, which in desperation she had contacted because the UFO nuts had said to contact the media, and she was not wanting to see them again. UFO naughts I meant, not UFO nuts. We're the UFO nuts. And at this stage I'd not actually met Maureen. That was the day I spoke to her on the telephone, and only spoken to her for 1 hour. But when I invited her to address one of our meetings, we had the National Mutual Theatrette at the time, a delightful little theatrette, and she agreed to do this, and we sat her down the front where she couldn't see all the people coming in, and I said, well, you'll be comfortable there and you won't see anybody. So when she got up to speak, she was staggered at the number of people that were filling the hall and outside into the lobby. But that hall was crowded, and it was very, very quiet, right through the whole hour of her talk. And even the people outside who were standing were perfectly quiet. Everybody was thoroughly fascinated. During the period, the question period that time, Maureen was put through her paces. She did think that what she saw was a psychic phenomena. And did she suffer any burns or after effects? To both these questions, the first one was, did she think it was a psychic phenomena? And to both the questions she answered no. Did she think there were any other witnesses? She thought there must have been one at least, because as she was approaching the railway crossing, she saw a man with a torch leading a cow across the railroads, and surely the UFO must have passed it over him, but would have been going in the same direction, so he may not have seen it. Later the man's wife contacted her, and also another lady living on the ridge, the range ridge there, who'd seen a light coming across the road. Both had seen this. The third experience was purely a psychic experience, and this happened about 6 months later. It was one Wednesday evening. I'd received a phone call from a rather agitated Maureen, who said she'd been trying to contact 2 other representatives. Probably a good thing that she couldn't contact them, because she may have had to have gone public, and I don't think she really wanted that. She was quite happy to speak at our meeting, but not to go public in media or publications. For some days she'd been hearing a voice calling to her, Maureen, return to the meeting place. And it didn't matter where she went, she could hear this voice. She heard it at the front door, and she went to answer the door, and the husband said, who was that? Because the husband was in a wheelchair at this stage. He was an invalid and had been for some time. And she said there was nobody there. She went up shopping and turned around to hear somebody who'd been saying, "Maureen, Maureen, return to the meeting place." And this was getting on her nerves a bit. I think she was getting a little bit worried as she was going shopping that day. And she felt that she had to go to the meeting place and was too scared to go alone. So when she rang my number, I told Paul, and off we both trotted that night. We took our supper with us and went off in his car down to meet Maureen at the meeting place. We said we'd wait to see her at an electrical substation, which was right opposite where we were going to be. And she came along about 8:30 and rather agitatedly dashed over from her car to ours. And we were there, really quite early. It was still, I think, only just light. And she came over, rushing over and saying, "I nearly went off the road back there." And I said, "Well, I suggest you tell us all about it when we drive to the meeting place." So she said that there was, before going further, I should perhaps add that as I entered her car to go away to the meeting place, I had an odd feeling when I touched the electrical experience when I touched the door of her car, and I got a sort of an electric shock, which probably wouldn't have been unusual for me because I thought maybe being somewhere near the substation, it might have had an effect on the car, and touching the metal handle might have had an effect of a slightly electric shock on myself. However, I got into the car and I said, she'd told me that there was a little man sitting there when she'd turned around the corner up there, and I said, "Is he still there?" And I thought, well, if he is, I'm sitting on him. And she said, "No, he went when I got out of the car," when she got out of the car. And I said, "What did he look like?" And that she was really quite shocked at this. And he got out of the car. He was like a little man, she said, but in a tinsel type suit. He was silvery, and he was described as sitting exactly where I was, which was quite close to her in the middle of the seat, because I thought Paul was going to come in with us, and I'd moved in. But he wasn't there, and I couldn't visualise it. I had no idea. I mean, I might have a very good imagination at times, but it didn't run to that extent. And when we got back to the meeting place, which was a little drive off among some trees, Paul got into the back of her car, and I was sitting in the front with her still. And we were talking about the latest incident when she grabbed my arm and shook me, and she pointed across and she said, "There he is. Can't you see him? And can't you see him?" And she's sitting there shaking me like Billy-O. And I tried to explain to her that it was possibly like closed-circuit television from them to her. And she said he was coming closer to the car. In fact, he was so close that had I put my arm out, I could possibly touch him. And I was edging closer to her because she said that he wanted her to get out of the car. And I said, "Well, come on, I'll come with you." And she wasn't going to get out anywhere. She was hanging onto that steering wheel. She wasn't going to move. So we asked Paul if he would get out of the car, brave Paul, and walk around the car to see what the entity would do. And he did. He was brave enough to do it. And I said to Maureen, "What's the entity doing, Maureen?" And she said, "He's taken a step back to let Paul get between the car and himself." So, and she adamantly declared she still wasn't going to get out of it. So I tried still trying to gently ease her out of the car. Anyway, the entity then became impatient, and he started to walk away or move away and disappeared behind some thin bushes there. And she suddenly commenced describing the interior of the object. She said, "Oh, I'm inside the object." And I said, "Well, what's it like?" And she told us that the entity had been standing there pointing to a large mushroom-like thing, like object in the centre of the circular room. It was a huge circular room, she said. Couldn't see any doors or windows or anything. The centre object, which was taller than an average person, was a bit like a jelly. She said the first part was a bit like a clock, you know, with the Roman numerals all the way around it. And there's another part of it, interior part, which seemed to be moving like a jelly. So I asked her if it was like a gyroscope. And she said, "What's a gyroscope?" Well, we'd asked her that later on, and she had no idea what a gyroscope was, so we went on with this. She said there were like Roman numerals. Apparently, looking around the room, she became very agitated, started to cry, and I put my arm around her shoulder. And she says, "I can't get out, I can't get out. There are no doors or windows. I can't get out." And that was her great fear at the time. She was in this UFO and couldn't get out. She didn't realise she was still sitting there with me. And she was really upset, and I clearly visualised what she was telling us, as if there was a picture in front of us. I knew exactly what she was describing. She said the little man was standing there pointing to this object, and she was watching and didn't take her eyes off it. So I decided, because she was so upset and agitated, that I was getting a bit concerned about her, because I could feel her tears falling down onto my hand, which was around her shoulders. And I directed my thoughts to them, and I thought, well, I've got nothing to lose. And I thought, well, you know, I'm fearful for her state of health. If you can help her, please do. And you got her into this state, so get her out of it. And I felt she might have had a nervous breakdown or a stroke or something. She was just so upset. And anyway, they said she said they wanted her to close her eyes. And I said, well, go ahead. And she said, no, I'm not going to close my eyes. And you know, when you blink, you have no idea of blinking because you do it so naturally. So she obviously blinked, and then I could feel her relax. And she must have gone out into a sort of a trance or a coma or whatever you like to call it. And then she began again to describe the interior of the object, and she still could see no way out, and she was still upset. And after a brief period, she sort of came back to us. She relaxed and she said, oh, I'm back again. And I said to Paul, well, let's have this cup of tea. We had a cup of tea with us, and we'll discuss it further and see what else we can make out of this, and see what she can get, see if Maureen can remember anything extra. So we put the lights on, and we got the thermos flask out and handed Maureen a cup of tea. And she's all of a sudden, even with a cup of tea in her hand, she said, oh, I'm back in there again. And she started describing it again and repeated the whole description all over again. And after a little while, she said more calmly, he's gone. And he's gone this time. I said, how do you know he's gone? She said, the feeling's different. It's gone completely. He's gone. It feels different. So now she came back to normal again. And everything seemed quite normal, so we went on with our supper and discussing the mushroom. And I was trying to identify it because she wasn't very technically minded. And I asked if it was like a gyroscope, but Maureen was apparently unfamiliar with that term. I'd only come into met the term because I was working with an airline, and they took us through all the area where they used to do up the aircraft and go over all these things. So I knew what it was. And she picked up a little gadget off the dashboard and said, would this be like it? And to my astonishment, it was one of those tiny little compasses that people have stuck on their dashboard. And she said that was almost identical to the mushroom that she'd been viewing. And it sticks on this little one sticks on the dashboard, you know, with a suction cup. I hadn't seen one before, and I haven't seen one since. But we didn't let her drive home alone, and she didn't wish to go either on her own because she was afraid that they might come back again. And she didn't want another visit from her friends, so-called, or the nerves on the part of the drive. She thought she might have had an accident or something. So I drove in her car, and Paul followed us, and we went further down the line, further away from home. And I believe at this time that it was about 10:30 or 11 o'clock when we got down to her home. We didn't really take that much notice of the time, but it was about that time. And, of course, the events went through the air again. Her husband was there, and we made a cup of tea and sat and discussed it again. And was I able to communicate with the entity when he said to close her eyes? Did I really communicate with them? Did they receive my thoughts regarding her agitated state? This is just our own thoughts after this. If so, what thoughts can they receive from more important and delicate situations than that particular one? Can they transmit to us? Can we transmit to them? I do believe that as science has gone on since those years, of course, naturally, we can communicate a lot more easily with in so many various ways. And I thought perhaps at this stage that, have you ever watched a hypnotist on a stage, at work, when they get a whole lot of people there, and they can either, I can't hypnotise you, or come on, I can hypnotise you, and they get up there and they put them under, as we say. And when I snap my fingers, you will go into a deeper trance, or you'll come out of it, or you'll do such and such a thing. Was this second or third case the time when they snapped their fingers at Maureen Puddy and she went along and went into this so-called trance and visualised the inside of this object? Was the second meeting of that such case in her car just prior to speaking to her, was that the time when they perhaps snapped their fingers then? That if you could be in a vacuum, then I've been in one, such an incident. There was no sound, there was no movement, all was calm and quiet. Then the voice delivered the message. Was the third incident due to the snapping of the fingers when they urged her to act? If this is so, how many people can they hypnotise? I'll put it that way. Perhaps in their sleep, so we react when they wish us to, or whenever they snap their fingers. I find this a very sobering thought. Perhaps some of the abductions are the result of this snapping of the fingers by them. Thank you for your attention.
Lights up, please. Our next speaker is well known to all of us here in the Australian UFO community, especially here in New South Wales. He's known for speaking his mind even when we don't want to hear what must be said. Consider this quote from his article in the most recent issue of the UFO Reporter magazine that's available back there at the bookstall. The way UFO investigators go about their research has to change radically. The self-censorship practiced by many UFO groups on their own researchers as to what is an acceptable research direction has severely limited our work. We need to be more accommodating of diverse opinions. We should work openly and as a team. We need to look at all the data fellow researchers can produce for the critical information that we seek. He has been active in UFO organizations since 1973. He served as president of the Australian Centre for UFO Studies from 1985 to 1990. He is also one of the founders of UFO Research New South Wales in 1991, along with Brian Dickinson and Moria Magee, and served as president of this group until just last year. You could say that right now he's taking a bit of a breather, but let me ask you, just how do you let go of the tail of a tiger? Please welcome Paul Sowiak.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, or should I say good evening? Or good afternoon, sorry. Well, it's a pleasure to be here as part of this conscious sharing. And I think we'll all agree that this has been a great success and a great conference. And there's been a sharing of information nationally. There are three types of ufologists. There's the investigator, there's the researcher, and there's the theorist. I fall into the third category, which is the theorist side. Ufologists are extraordinary people, unravelling the mysteries of the extraordinary world we live. I'm proud to be part of this awakening of the human mind with my colleagues here before you today as a panel of experts dwelling into the consciousness of man. What is real and what is not? Casnadia de Jon wrote, Tales of Power, that we perceivers of the world, but the world we perceive is an illusion created by the description given to us at birth. And we maintain this illusion through reason and talk. So when we talk about ufology, we're talking about a mystic or a mysterious part of our being. And I think it needs to be understood. As a UFO theorist, I've been investigating the phenomena for the last 23 years and only recently begun to start putting the pieces together to get a greater understanding of the subject. My earliest conference paper last year examined the postulation the human race was created by an alien race. This was confirmed by Linton Newton Howe in her book Alien Harvest, suggesting that we're abducted for genetic material along with cattle. Today I will speak about classes of aliens coexisting with human race in terms of origins, mannerisms and behaviour. Before I start, I'll just say that I've had competing needs for my time in the last week. I'm going on holidays on Monday and unfortunately I backed the camper van into a brick wall. I've had to do a few repairs. Okay, where does one, and I also chased that blimp last night that slowed things down as well. This is straight off the printer about half an hour ago. Where does one start to rediscover the information about alien influences here on Earth? Human history is full of 3, 4, 5 and 6-fingered giants and dwarf people. The Bible is a great history book of such matters. In Genesis 6:4, in those days when the sons of gods had intercourse with daughters of men and had children by them, the Nephilim were on earth. They were heroes of old, men of renown. In Hebrew, giant translates as Raphael. Raphala is the plural, Raphailism, of uncertain emetology. They were tall, large-framed, powerful. They lived southwest of Jerusalem in Johassa. Various ufologists have tried to classify aliens in lines of classification. I'd like to go to that second overhead, thank you. Thanks, Andrew. Okay, classification of aliens. What they've done is they've looked at it and they said, okay, we're looking at the degree of strangeness. And they tried to look at the physical appearance. Some people looked at the actual clothing they wear and classified them by their clothing. Obviously, the ideal way would be to find out where they came from and classify them by their origin. But that seems a little bit difficult because we're being abducted, not them being abducted by us. Okay, McCall, John D. Heavra and Alvin Lawson in 1977 derived a group or categories of aliens. Human, there. Then you've got your humanoid, basic bipedal shape, head, 2 arms, 2 legs. Then you've got your animal. Then you've got your robot. Then you've got your exotic. And then you've got your apparitions. It's an interesting classification. Can we go to that overhead, Hugh? In this next overhead, we've looked at another study that looked at the various types of aliens that have been picked up. And they all seem to have some basic characteristics. As you can see from there, what are they? They're all bipedal. In other words, they've got 2 arms, 2 legs and a head. They're humanoid in structure. And our evolutionists suggest that as a consequence of evolution, the eyes come forward, the brain is fairly close to the eyes, and for mobility and dexterity we need arms and we need legs. So that seems to be maybe universal for. Okay, next overhead please. Thanks, Hugh. Okay. MacDonald also looked at the classification system and came up with this scenario. And what we're looking at here is we've got a grey, we've got the Roswell figures, we've got neonate, which is basically infant humanoid shape, then we've got the Nordic group, then we've got the reptilian, and then we've got the hybrid, which is a cross between us and them. Now, when you look at all that, it doesn't seem to make a great deal of sense, and it seems to be a little bit all over the place. But basically it's bipedal, you've got a head, 2 arms and a leg. It's very common. I postulate to combine the groups based on functions and alien strata derived from abduction experiences. Can we go to slide 6, right through that little section, please? Okay, my classification, I'm looking at the first class being animal, and the chupacabras of Puerto Rico would be one that would fit into that category. It was described as large, wet, black, hairy gorilla-like, about 5 foot tall. Does it sound like an animal to you? Yeah, okay. In Babylonian times, you had the Onus, which was a god, and it was basically a fish-tailed humanoid type person, a god. And in Africa, you looked at the Dogon, from the Dogon group in Africa, the Dogon tribe, fish-tailed. Okay, that's the animal classification. The next group I think we should classify as would be humanoids. And these would include the reptilians and the Nordics, and basically the ones that were fairly similar to... You keep on going with those? Sorry, Andrew. Basically just the humanoid shape, but it seem to exhibit sort of human or vulnerable characteristics. The next group, well, I considered important, was the human hybrid clones, and the Nordics, would fall into this group. Hybrid clones settle and supervise abductions and take up functions perhaps like psychologists or social workers on board these ships based on some of the information from the abducting experience. That's the sort of abduction scenario we're looking at. Just keep on going with those for that group, if you would, Andrew. Okay, the next group, so after groups, humanoids are broken down into 2 groups. Humanoids, which is basic, and the hybrid or clones, which is the Nordic group. So we've got 1 animals, 2 humanoids, 3. Now the third classical group would be the androids. And the greys would fit into this sort of classification. And we're looking at beehive control, short-term memory, basic function type units. In other words, robots. And the 4th category is apparitions, or holographic projections. And an example of this would be aliens that have been observed that can't be totally visibly identified or seen, that have a wispy nature about them, that probably don't exhibit any feet. Okay? So the fetal mode of movement is not clear. That's the suggestion that I'm looking at. So there's 4 classifications. You've got animals, you've got humanoids, it's broken down into hybrids and clones, and then you've got the androids or robots, and you've got the apparitions. So you've got basically 4 groups based on what they're on about. What I might do is now go into some of those groups a little bit. So we're looking at the animal class, where we can look at the chupacabras, blood-sucking vampires, creatures from Puerto Rico, Mexico, and South United States of America. They kin animals and attack humans. The chupacabras is a Spanish word meaning chupa, which is to suck, and cabras, which is goats. So they're basically goat suckers. Well, that's the description from the native nationals that live in those areas. They're described as having 3 toes, 3 fingers, with 50mm long fingernails, and they smell like wet dogs that have been in a sewer. They have small pointed ears, they're thin, patchy spotted hair, and shades of grey and oranges. And I suppose you'd all like to meet one of those. On the 11th of March 1995, just more or less recently, at a town of Orquistas, in the centre of an island in Puerto Rico, Ewan Brato Hermendez found 8 of his sheep dead with 3 strange puncture holes in their chest. And there's been reports of human attacks more recently. Okay, the second group, which is class 2. Can we go to slide overhead 17, please? Majestic has come to the fore with Stanton Friedman and others as being a reliable document and evidence that the United States Air Force were doing covert UFO tactical surveillance and retrievals relating to UFO events. And they've classified in their manual, and that's a page from the front of their manual, two types of extraterrestrials. And I would put these into the human class, which is category 2. The first one is EBE type 1, and they're humanoids similar to humans in appearance, and could be mistaken for Oriental person. Bipedal, 5 to 5 foot 4 inches in height, weighing 80 to 100 pounds. Similar to human, with slightly larger and more rounded cranium. The skin is pale, chalky yellow in colour, thick, slightly pebbled in appearance. The eyes are small, wide set, almond shaped, with brown-black iris with very large pupils. The whites of the eyes are not like that of humans, but have pale grey cast. The ears are small and not low in the skull. The nose is thin and long, and the mouth wider than humans, nearly lipless. There is no facial hair or very little body hair, that being very fine and confined to the underarms and groin area. The body is thin without apparent body fat, but muscles are well developed. The hands are small, 4 long digits, but no opposing thumb. The outside digit is joined in a manner as to be almost nearly opposable. There is no webbing between the fingers as in humans, and the legs are slightly but noticeably bowed, and the feet are somewhat splayed and proportionately large. That's type 1. Type 2, the Air Force classification under Majestic, is that these entities are human but different from type 1. They are bipedal, 3 foot 5 to 4 foot 2 inches in height, and weigh 25 to 30 pounds. The head is much larger than human or type 1. The cranium is much larger and elongated. The eyes are very large, slanted, and nearly wrapped around the side of the skull. They are black with no whites showing. There's no noticeable brow bridge, and the skull has a sleep peak that runs over the crown. The nose consists of 2 small slits, with slits high above the slit-like mouth. The external ears. The skin is a pale bluish grey colour. The being's somewhat darker on the back of the creature. It's very smooth and fine cell. There's no hair, no facial body hair, and the creature does not appear to be mammalian, feeding young with breast milk. The arms are long in proportion to the legs, and the hands have 3 long tapered fingers and a thumb that is nearly as long as the fingers. The second finger thicker than others, but not as long as the index finger. The feet are small and narrow, and the 4 toes are joined together with a membrane. Majestic points out that these 2 types of creatures may have originated from different planets. They're fairly substantial classification of people who are occupants of UFOs or associated with UFO activity, and they're fairly significant comments on the different classes. We obviously haven't seen them to do autopsies on, but we are dealing with eyewitness reports that starts to mirror some of that information there, which suggests that it's correct. The third type of, or the second subclass of humanoid I mentioned earlier was the Nordic tall blondes. They're about 6 to 7 feet tall, handsome, blonde shoulders, length hair, with blue eyes, kind and loving. Now, this information is coming from abductees. People have been abducted onto flying saucers, and these are their stories. Now, they may not be totally correct, but in essence they must be getting roughly around the right information. And the consistency between reports, so we're starting to build some pictures. He is parental, watchful, smiling and affectionate, youthful, all-knowing, and wears tight-fitting uniform, a guardian angel. Usually seen with small greys. They have vivid blue eyes and seem to look alike. The small beings mentioned before, the skin is reported to be soft and poreless, with rubbery or plastic feel to it. The tall being's skin is rough and more leathery. Neither type of being has hair, musculoskeletal, and distinguishing marks like warts or moles or discoloration are not seen. Abductees describe alien skin colour in varying shades of grey, from dark grey to chalk white. Tall beings have an air and authority about them. Maybe they represent some sort of hierarchy within aliens, such as a doctor or psychologist on board these ships. The small beings appear to be controlled by them. Okay, the next group, which are the androids. Now, the most typical android, I believe, that is seen by abductees is the grey. I don't believe the grey is a humanoid. I believe it is a part robot, part animal type android is the word I'm looking for. And you look at the behaviour of them, they never run, they never get excited, they're very cool, they just do their job and their functions, and when things get into trouble or there's a problem, a taller being comes in and controls the situation, as we saw at the Kelly Cahill. Number 18, please. Okay. And other examples would be the Hopkinsville Kelly sighting, where we saw this sort of frog-like humanoid with the big ears. Now that was reported as being silvery, so that's probably a robot. And Pascagoula is also an unusual shaped one. Could you go to number 19, please? We're looking at aspirations or holographic projections. We're looking at a different group. We're looking at them disappearing from view, not as walking or being beamed up, but actually decreasing or dematerialising is that group there. Now obviously we can go into a lot more history about where they come from and what they're doing, but we don't have time to deal with that today. I will be writing a book on this particular subject, and it should be out within the next 12 months, so you can hold me to that. And we'll be looking at these particular issues a bit more carefully. So in conclusion, I'd just like to make a comment about Paddy Barton's statements and paper yesterday. The Copernican revolution was 1543, where man moved away from his concept of the centre of the universe. I don't want to work backwards, to move backwards towards a centralised universe where we think we're the centre of the universe. Holograms exist. It's the composite of intellectual life manifestations of the universe, not just the planet Earth and humanoids. The Earth is being visited and coexistence with aliens ever since time began. Human awareness in 1990 has finally realised their presence. Where they be extra or intra-terrestrial or dimensional beings, we are not alone. May the force be with you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Paul. Our next speaker will continue where this film